Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for today's SRE conversation. We're going to be talking about working in remote and distributed teams and what it means for many of us in a world that's changed very rapidly over the last 6 months. I spent almost 10 years of my career working as a remote engineer. I and many people on my team were spread out around the world, and there were a few core people in a central office. There were a lot of lessons we learned over those years on what it means to be successful in a remote team, what the differences are between remote and distributed teams, and why they really matter when you're trying to build successful organizations. The information we're going to be sharing today is for engineers and individual contributors who are working in a remote environment at the moment and want to be more successful and learn how to do that, and also for organizational leaders, people, whether they're managers, executives, or even just senior ICs, who are responsible for team building and culture and helping their own organizations grow. So let's get started. I'll be going over some of my background, who I am, what kind of work I've done as a remote engineer, and how it's differed from local environments where I've been in an office. We'll be talking a little bit about what success should look like. When you're working in a remote team or in a local team, you really need to have some criteria of what is success for an individual, for an organization. So we'll be talking about some of those topics. We'll also have lessons for individuals on the things that they can do to be more successful. And there'll also be some lessons for leaders of organizations on things that they should be doing to promote healthy remote working environments. So hi, as I mentioned, I'm Avleen, and I work from home. And I expect right now, most, if not all of you work from home as well. There have been a lot of changes over the last 6 months. We don't know when these changes are going to come to an end. For many of us, they may not for a long time. And so it's really important for us to be able to understand what this new world means, because organizations are going to have different demands of us. They're going to expect different things of us, and we should be ready for that. So I've been working from home mostly since 2009. I switched to my recent job at Facebook and have spent the last 2 years as a local engineer in an office, and now I'm back to remote again. I also like cats. I have a lot of cats. They make working from home a lot easier and a lot more fun most of the time. Even when they're jumping on, in front of the camera to get on a VC or something, they really bring a lot of light to otherwise stressful situations. And I know a number of people who have actually picked up pets since this lockdown has begun. And it's really nice to see people adopting and fostering animals and seeing how happy it makes them. I also like to tell stories, and you're going to find a lot of stories as we go through this presentation. So first of all, I would like to say thanks a lot, COVID. I've been promoting working remotely to organizations for a long time. I think there is huge benefit to it, and I know that the virus has brought a lot of downsides, and it's certainly nothing to make light of. But this is an opportunity as well for a lot of companies and organizations to see the benefits of having their employees be remote. There's been a lot of fear over time, especially from larger organizations who didn't necessarily know how to have large, successful, distributed, and remote teams. And now that we've all been kind of forced to learn about what they mean, we're in at the deep end. And so in that regards, well, hey, thanks a lot, virus, for all the chaos and mayhem. And it certainly hasn't been great fun for a lot of people. But we can also look at some silver linings that do exist. And hopefully, as we go through this, we'll come out a lot stronger and have a lot more, flexibility in the way people can work. So the virus has really caused us to change very rapidly. And I know that this meant a lot of upheaval for a lot of you, and actually for a great number of my friends and colleagues, it meant just not being able to work for quite a considerable amount of time. Just either not having the support they needed from their organization, or unfortunately, losing their jobs, um, and having a hard time finding jobs. There's been a serious lack of preparedness in the industry uh, around this topic. Um, Having to dive in at the deep end, like I mentioned, there's been no time for any of us to acclimate to this if we weren't used to it. I mentioned that I worked remotely for well, 7 years, and then like another 2 years, so almost 10 years. Um, and even I, after going back to an office for 2 years, had to readjust to being remote. I had moved house. I didn't have my remote working environment set up correctly. In fact, I didn't even really have a proper desk. And so there have been a lot of challenges that we've had to face trying to adjust to this. So the question is, what is it that we can do now? So if you go back and you watch some of my older videos on, how to be successful working at home, I'll talk about some of the same topics again today, but I won't necessarily cover all of them. I do recommend going back and taking a look at those. Um, it'll help you with setting up your schedule and your work environment and so on. Um, but there are important things that we've learned since then that I want to talk about. And the first one is that we can start by defining success. It's a thing that we often don't do when we're doing our work. Like we may have goals that we set for every quarter or every half or every year that we want to achieve, and those kind of like start to define what success means. But at a broader level, what does success mean for an individual in your organization? So a lot of the challenges that we face when we're working are cultural, and by that I mean uh, the way that people work together is much about your personal actions and the culture of your team and the organization as a whole. So there are expectations of you as an individual. There are expectations that you have of the organization and the organization that you work for has of you. And there are short-term and long-term deliverables. And each one of these needs to have its own set of success criteria. In order to do that, you need to look at what is it that you're trying to achieve for yourself in terms of your career and your personal growth. What is it that the organization wants you to deliver? What is the business goal, and how are you furthering the needs of the business? And turn those into short-term deliverables, things that you can meet over the next 3 months, maybe the next 6 months. And then long-term deliverables. Set out plans for what you're going to make happen in the next year and in the next 2 years. And as you do this, think about the ways in which working at home changes what you're able to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these challenges you're going to face. All of this goes towards building remote happy cultures. We have to think about a culture that happens in an office as being distinct from a culture that happens with remote engineers. They are two vastly different things. The culture in your office environment may have been built around certain ideas or certain norms about how you interact with each other, how people get together socially, how people work together. Do you just walk up and talk to people whenever you need to? Are there social cues around when people have headphones on so that you don't interrupt them? Various other things that we end up just taking for granted. And you have to recreate these social norms in a remote environment. And it's difficult, but you have to start by realizing that you're not going to be able to carry your old culture, whatever it was, and just have it automatically apply when your entire workforce is remote. So sit back for a moment and think about how many remote engineers you have on your team. Well, right now it's probably all of them. But before we had the situation that we're in now, how many remote engineers did you have? How many do you want to have in the future? When we get out of this crazy, lockdown situation or having as much social distancing as we do now. Hopefully that will come to an end at some point. But think about at that point, how many remote engineers do you want on your team, and what are you going to do to promote healthy remote cultures? I can guarantee that almost all of your competitors in whatever industry you're in are already looking at ways to continue having remote engineers. So if you as an individual who's responsible for building team culture, or you as an organizational leader isn't thinking about that, you're going to be at a disadvantage. We've learned a lot about what it means to have distributed and remote teams in the last 20 years. And there's a few common structures that come up, and this may help you when you're trying to figure out what that future should look like. The first one is that everyone can be local. This is very common. This is it's almost the default that we've been in for hundreds of years, where everybody works in the same office, everyone is close together. This happens very easily if your office is small or your company is small, and you can just locate everybody in the same place. The second is that you can have distributed teams. This is where you have maybe multiple local teams in different places. So let's say you have an office in San Francisco, an office in New York, one in London, one in Singapore, and each office has its own local teams doing their own thing. And they may interact with each other. They may share some workloads, or they may have some interactions and interfaces where they pass information between each other, but they're really each doing their own thing. And the third structure is where you actually have remote teams. And this is where the majority of the team are in different places. So I mentioned with distributed teams, maybe you have people, local teams in San Francisco, New York, London, Singapore, Sydney, wherever it is, and they're all doing their own local thing. In the remote teams case, you have individuals scattered around the globe. So while they may be all on one team, the individuals may be in Vancouver, Toronto, Atlanta, Manchester, Dublin, Paris, wherever they are. And then step 3 is learning to overcome challenges for individuals. So the first thing I used to hear, way back before this all started, is when I would tell people, hey, hi, I'm Avleen, I work from home. Everyone would be like, wow, that must be so easy. That's so great. You don't have to commute. You don't have to, you don't have to get dressed in the mornings. You don't have to do anything. You just like roll out of your bed and into your chair and just like start working, and you can take a break whenever you want. So working at home is easy, right? Like, it's not. And I think one of the important lessons that individuals and organizations have learned over the last 6 months is that working remotely is hard. Working remotely has so many unique challenges that we just don't think about. So I'll introduce you to Ether. This is one of my cats. He's one of my remote engineer buddies, and he is always happy. He loves to sleep, he loves to eat, he loves to come join me for breakfast, but the important thing is that he is always comfortable. And he's realized that wherever he's working, whatever he's doing, he needs to make sure he's doing it comfortably. So I mentioned that, in some of my previous videos on working from home, I've talked about, the importance of creating your work environment in a good way, something that's comfortable, something that really, lets you get things done. Have a good desk, have a good chair, have a good monitor. Don't be cramped and hunched over, a tiny little laptop screen. Because when you were working in an office, you probably weren't doing those things. You probably had a nice, good, ergonomic environment to work at. So my first bit of solid advice to everybody would be set up your home environment. Do it right. There's lots of information out there. Be like this guy. Be comfortable. Never settle for less. It'll make a huge difference to your ability to get work done. The second bit of advice I have is if you're new to working from home, especially like, if you live in an area where the weather isn't always great, maybe it's gray a lot, maybe it rains a lot, um, maybe it's cold a lot. When you have a nice sunny day, maybe you think, hey, you know what? I'm just gonna go and like I'll take my phone and my laptop and I'll just go work from the beach for a while and it'll be great. And no one will know, but like it'll be awesome, right? Um, Everyone will know. Right? You're gonna do things, you're gonna, take breaks, you're gonna go wade in the water, you're going to have a great time, but your mind isn't going to be focused on getting your work done. Your mind's going to be focused on what a great day it is and the fact that you're at the beach. And also, it really sucks when you get sand in your laptop. Like, trust me, it's one of the worst things that you can do. If it's a nice day, take a break, take a day off, go to the beach, have fun, relax, socially distant, wear a mask, but be comfortable doing it. But don't mix those things. Don't mix that work with the hanging out at the beach, pleasure, fun time. Keep those two things separate, and it's okay to do that. One of the hardest things I see from people who are new to working remotely is that their work hours tend to skew. Either they start later in the day and finish later in the day, or they just extend their work hours. Well, they used to commute from 8 to 9 in the morning, or 9 to 10 in the morning. So why not just spend that time working? Hey, that's great, but you need to also have balance between how much you're working, what you were doing before. That commute time used to be yours. You used to own it. You used to probably do things other than working. You were maybe on social media, maybe you're listening to a podcast, maybe you were talking to some friends, but you probably weren't working. So don't necessarily spend that entire time, just extending your work hours. Find good balance in what you're trying to do. So when we're talking about building a remote team, there are some important things that as organizational leaders we need to think about. The first one is communication and collaboration. How do people on your team work together? And there's an important uh, there's an important law called Conway's law about the way that your organization communicates tends to mirror the product that you're creating. I'm vastly oversimplifying this and probably not doing it great justice, um, but you'll find quite often that when you are working on a team, whatever product your team is creating, whether it's just something internally that you deliver to your company, or whether it's a larger product for public consumption, the way that it tends to work and the way the information flows through that product very closely mirrors the way the information flows through your organization. So you really want to think about what it is you're trying to achieve when you're working on a product locally versus remotely. You need to set up the communication and the collaboration mechanisms so that you're actually working towards delivering a successful product at the end. And keep Conway's law in mind, because it's really true and it really does work and it does apply in so many cases. The second thing is building a culture. I mentioned earlier that in a local office you may have had one particular kind of culture where it was around the way people communicate, the way people work together when when they're physically near each other, and it's different now. It's different not just for the way people work, but for the way people become successful, the way that people get promoted, the way the people's work is recognized. All of these things are different now, and they all are a part of the culture that you create for your teams. You have to think about how individuals are going to be successful in this new environment. How do you recognize the work that they've done? How do you recognize also the struggles that they're going through and account for those in a fair and just way? The expectations that you had of individuals and the way that they were working before aren't going to apply in this new world with everybody working remotely. So it's a good opportunity for both individuals and organizational leaders to kind of step back, reset a little bit, and think about what it is that both the organization and the individual need, and how can they achieve it together. And this leads into hiring and accountability for sure. I mentioned, the way people are going to get promoted is going to be different. The way people are going to be recognized for the work is going to be different. But also, simply the way that work is accounted for is going to be different. None of us wants to end up in a world where we're filling out timesheets constantly. Like, that's no fun. I've done it. We don't want to end up in that world. But we still need ways to uh, account for the work that people are doing and how they're actually successful. Are they doing the right things? Are they having an impact with the work that they're doing? And when we hire people, it was really easy before. You could bring people into an office, they could sit down with the team, they could sit down with individuals, go to lunch with them, maybe have social time with them afterwards, really integrate very well with the other people on a team, and hopefully partner teams as well. And it's way more difficult to do that now. We're lucky that all of this went down at a time when we have really great user-friendly tools like Slack and Facebook Workplace and Microsoft Teams and various other things that are enabling people to communicate better with each other, and other people on their teams. So think about, like, your hiring pipeline and your onboarding process are probably going to need a complete revamp. They're really going to need different ways of making sure people are learning the things that maybe were just kind of taken for granted when you were in an office. Maybe the engineers on a team, when somebody was hired, would just like grab that person, take them into a conference room, and just start whiteboarding the way that everything in the office, everything on that team works. And other people in the office might do the same thing and just like brain dump and share this stuff. And it's harder now. So now you need to think about other tools and other mechanisms that you can be using to, onboard people more successfully. And the next thing is, I mentioned work environments. It's probably the third or fourth time I think in this conversation that I'm mentioning work environments, but they are so important and so vital to success. When I started out, coming back to being remote again, I mentioned I didn't have a desk. I didn't have most of my stuff since I moved. I ended up working with my laptop on a makeup table, and kind of an old IKEA chair. Nothing wrong with IKEA chairs; they're fine for short-term use. But it wasn't the most comfortable chair for sitting in for 8 to 10 hours a day. Um, and I was just I was always hunched over, like trying to focus on what I was doing. It wasn't a good setup. It wasn't a good environment for me to be working in. Um, and this isn't something that should entirely fall on individuals. Organizations have to step up and play a part in helping individuals set up their work environment, whether that's providing equipment, a monitor, um, you know, um, a VC device, better ergonomic keyboards and things like that, um, or providing the funds to do this kinds of stuff, or letting people take one of those nice fancy chairs from the office home for a few months. Like, all of these things are things that both individuals and organizations are responsible for making successful. So this is not, I want to make sure that I express that this is not just something that individuals should bear the burden of figuring out by themselves. If you're an employer, if you lead an organization, you really have to find a way to help your engineers and your employees have successful, good, healthy work environments. So I mentioned the top priorities are, when you're setting up remote teams: communication, having discipline, and actual work-life balance. Let's talk a little bit more about that discipline, though, right? I think it's really easy when you're, especially when you're new to remote working, and you haven't gone through this process of just really figuring out how to be successful in it, and you're just kind of drifting by. It's really easy to lose a lot of the discipline that you might have had when you worked in an office. Maybe you didn't get to work at exactly the same time every day. Maybe you didn't leave at exactly the same time every day. But you more than likely got up, got ready, maybe had some breakfast, commuted to the office. There was a set of things that you did every single day. And it's easy to lose sight of that when you're working remotely. The things I usually recommend here are that people set a start and end time for their work. Think about when you need to be around the most. Think about who is going to be expecting you to be around, and try to give some consistency so that other people also know when to expect that you'll be there and they can talk to you and engage with you. Take a vacation if you can. We talked about that going to the beach example, and it's hard right now, right? Especially if you're in an area that maybe has a high incidence of the virus outbreaks. It can be hard to get away. But you don't have to necessarily get away. You just have to get away from doing your daily work. I took a couple of weeks off to just take care of my family about 2 months ago, and I stayed at home. I didn't go anywhere, but I spent the entire time doing entirely different things from working than I normally would. I enjoy cooking dinner. I actually enjoy cleaning. I find it quite therapeutic. I enjoy going out and mowing the lawn, just because it's different to what I do on a daily basis. And so I spent 2 weeks just doing this other stuff. I spent every day cooking, cleaning, taking care of the yard, helping out, with the pets, running errands, doing everything other than working. And it was great. It was just a break from having to sit at my desk all day long, and just really feeling tired from doing it, especially when I didn't have that good desk setup. And sitting there was difficult. It was hard. So take a vacation, but what I mean is take a break. Take a break from doing work. You may not be able to take, your PTO to go somewhere this year, but do take that PTO. Getting a hobby is another example of something that I recommend often. I enjoy photography, and over here where I live now, the incidence of the virus has gone down quite a bit, enough that I can go out and start doing some astrophotography. So I like taking pictures of the night sky, of constellations, of star trails, and things like that. And it's been a great mental break to be able to do that, uh, instead of thinking about work all the time. And one of the problems that a lot of people have when they start working remotely is that they blur the line between their home life and their work life even more than they should. Like, it's already getting a little bit blurred just because you're in the same environment all the time, but it all mingles into one thing. It's really important to try and keep a separation between those two things. It goes back to that idea of setting start and stop times of when you're working. If you can, start at a certain time, stop at another, at a certain time, and then put that work stuff away. Just leave it alone. Um, so, as an example, of a schedule that I had when I started working remotely the first time, when I didn't know what I was doing. I would wake up, I would just kind of sit around, have some breakfast. I'd watch a little bit of TV because why not? Like, hey, I'm at home. This is what I do when I'm at home. I'd eat something. Eventually I'd get around to like catching up on emails, and I'd like bang out some code real quick and get some stuff done. I'd play with Ether, good fun. Um, and at some point in the afternoon, maybe, I have laundry that I need to do, so I'd focus on that. And then I'd be doing everything other than, having good work discipline. One of the easiest things I found to do was just to not actually work, just relax and start working whenever I felt like it. And that lack of discipline actually led to all manner of problems for me. Like, I had poor work performance. People at work noticed it. I wasn't meeting the expectations that I was supposed to, and it was just it wasn't working out. When I went to a better schedule and just sat down and decided, hey, this is when I'm supposed to be working, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing on a daily basis, things just changed rapidly. Everything got better, everything got easier, but it required me to have that discipline. The other thing when you're working from home, if you have a family, whether it's a partner or a partner and kids, or kids, perhaps you live with your parents or your grandparents or other people who aren't used to seeing you around the house, it can be very confusing for folks because and this is actually, I'm going to give you a quote from my wife. Um, when we had a discussion about me working from home, where they didn't understand that, what it means for me to be working from home, she said, it's really difficult for us um, to understand what you're doing because when we sit at a computer, we're playing games and we're having fun. So we see you sitting at a computer and we assume that you're supposed to be working, but like this is fun time, right? It's not, we have a different association between people sitting at computers and what they do. So you really need to have a conversation. If you live with, if you have a family or roommates or whatever that you live with who aren't working from home, um, you need to set some boundaries. You need to set some expectations. There was a recent study that Microsoft did. Uh, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review about a week ago, where they studied the effects and the ways people on some of their teams have been adapting to working from home over the last few months, and they found that it the variety of ways in which people work from home is way more than expected. They they found that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily work a solid 9 to 5 or whatever set block of time there is. There are a lot of people who break up their day because they have responsibilities with taking care of kids or taking care of family members. And actually, one of the advantages of working remotely is that you should be able to adjust your work time and adjust the way that you're working to fit around whatever responsibilities you have at home. But you still have to have clear delineations between when you're working, what you're doing, and when you're not working, and how the people around you can tell the difference between, Avleen's in work mode right now, he's working, don't disturb him, versus Avleen's on a lunch break right now, it's okay to have conversations with him and talk to him and ask him for help with things. So hopefully some of those things I've mentioned help individuals overcome challenges that they're facing right now or will be facing in the future. I'll touch on some more examples of these now. Um, Collaborate. Really find ways to work closely with the people on your team and partner teams if you're in a large organization. Find ways to change the communication that used to happen. If you used to walk up to people and talk to them, find things that work for all of you where maybe you can call people on VC randomly. Maybe you have some kind of, use Slack or, like I said, Workplace or Teams or something like that, where you can just talk to people, chat with people as needed. Communication is a cultural thing, and you're going to have to figure out what it is that works for you and your organization and really leverage it as heavily as you can. One of the things that a lot of people found challenging was how to lead projects when you're a remote engineer for the first time. It feels like because you're disconnected that it's harder to lead projects. And honestly, it is harder to lead projects. But it's a thing that you have to figure out how to do. And again, it goes back to those cultural aspects of your organization. How does the person who is leading a project check in with individuals on it? How does he or she track the work that that needs to happen, is happening right now? Are the expectations of the project being met? A lot of these may need to change. So keep it in mind, but there's no reason why individuals who are working remotely right now with all of us working remotely, or in the future where only some of us may be working remotely, there's no reason why individuals who are remote aren't able to lead large complex projects. It absolutely can be done. It just needs to be done slightly differently. And finally, again, I'm going to beat this drum for a while, but you have to set boundaries. It can be really easy to try and overcompensate if you feel like you're less productive. You know what? You're going to be less productive. When you're working remotely, you just are. But you can also be differently productive. There are things that you are hopefully able to do that other people may struggle with more. A great example of this is when I was working remotely previously, um, I lived in the same time zone as a lot of the other engineers, but we had a couple of engineers two engineers who were 5 hours ahead of us, and they were able to spend a good chunk of their day, the entire morning and early afternoon, online, getting things done, cranking things out with almost no interruptions that the rest of us just weren't able to do, because as soon as we were awake and working, everybody else was awake and working and interrupting us, asking us for help, asking us for advice or to do things. So yes, in some ways you will be less productive, but you will also be differently productive, and you will find ways to differentiate, productivity in an office with productivity working remotely. And it's really important that you try and find what that is. Step 4 is overcoming challenges for organizations. So as I mentioned before, we really need organizations to step up and support people who are remote and teams who are remote. One of the most difficult things, again, is staying connected, having that communication, having that information flow happening. When I was in the office, I would probably have 15 to 20 hours of meetings a week. Now that's a lot of meetings, but my particular role necessitated having a lot of meetings. I do a lot of communication and cross-functional work. There are a lot of other people around me who don't have nearly as many meetings, but they really the ones they have, they value a lot. They may only have 3 or 4 hours of meetings a week, but they're very, very specific. They're really honed in on what they're trying to do. And that connectedness, that information flow is vital. When we all went remote, I suddenly saw that there was a great drop-off in the amount of communication that happened on certain teams. And I think a lot of this comes down from organizational support, and especially at the management layer. Working remotely previously, I would usually have 2 or 3 one-on-ones with my manager in a week. They weren't long ones. They were maybe 10 or 15 minutes a piece, and usually later in the day, but they were incredibly valuable. And we didn't always talk about, how are my projects going, what's happening with the work I'm doing, what's happening with partner teams and so on. They were always about how are other people on the team doing? What has my manager heard about changes that are happening in the office, the news about the business? All this stuff would come down that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. And so managers who are supporting teams now also need to adapt in a different way, find out what works for you, but you need to spend more time getting that information across to the engineers who work for you. I practice Aikido, and one of the phrases that my sensei had taught me was centered, connected, whole, lively, and open. It's a technique that you practice in martial arts, and I think this phrase actually is really important also for remote workers, because I think these 5 things are really key to the success of an organization. You have to keep your people grounded and connected together to each other. They have to be able to understand what's happening around them. And they may understand what's happening on their local team, getting over these communication challenges with their peers, but they may not understand what's happening to the business around them. And it's the job of the manager and senior ICs and technical leaders and organizational leaders to really provide that information. There has to be energy on the team. It's so easy for teams to develop where everyone is going off and doing their own thing, disconnected from everybody else, and then eventually coming back together and like kind of presenting what's happened. That may work short term on some projects, but long term it often causes more problems because people drift apart. Those social bonds that we develop with each other, they just kind of break down because people aren't seeing that connection, that energy between each other. And finally, be open, right? It's hard enough for most of us to be open and honest when we're dealing with difficult situations face to face. It's way more difficult to be open and honest and deliberate about difficult situations when we're remote. It's easier just to like get up and walk away and not deal with problems, but it down again, this will only cause problems down the road. We have to find ways as leaders of organizations to encourage people to continue to have difficult conversations, to resolve conflicts in mature ways, and really be there to support each other. So I talked about this a little bit earlier on about supporting remote teams and what organizations should be doing. Your ICs, your staff, your engineers, they're going to need equipment. They're going to need the ability to repair or replace the equipment themselves if you don't have a fast supply chain to get new equipment to them. If I drop my laptop tomorrow, which could happen, how is it going to get replaced? What's going to happen? Can I call somebody? Can I go buy a laptop? Can I go take this to the Apple store to be repaired? What's the mechanism and what's the process there? If you're in an office, it's probably a lot easier. Maybe you have a team of people who helps with this kind of stuff. When everyone's remote, you need something new. You need something in place for your engineers. Once we do get through this whole situation, if you still have remote engineers, you're going to need a travel budget for them. Remote engineers are a valuable asset, but one of the things they depend on that I mentioned before is these social bonds between individuals on the team. And this means that they need to be able to travel and meet up with their peers, meet up with people for a week or two at a time. I found over 10 years of doing this that a really good balance is to have people all come together for about 2 weeks every quarter. And that's a lot for some people. Maybe they can only do a week every quarter. That's fine. But once you get past that 3-month mark, those bonds start to break down and people start to feel more tense around, getting work done. Small conflicts turn into big conflicts. And I expect that at this point, with many people having been working remotely for 4 to 6 months, that most of you have probably started to see this already. That, people that you would work with, on a regular basis, maybe you've talked to them a lot less. Maybe it's harder to talk to them. Maybe, something's just missing there. That was, it was there before, but it's not now. It's those social bonds breaking down. And as humans, we need that connection. We need to be able to see people. We need to spend time with people, not just in a work environment, but often outside a work environment. So if you have remote teams when we get through this situation, please remember to set aside some funds for a travel budget for people to come together at least 4 times a year. All of these things, and there are many more, they end up costing money. And I hear from a lot of people that, hey, remote engineers are cheaper, it's easier, like this is a great way to save money. And I think that's the wrong way for a lot of organizations to be thinking about it. Yes, payroll is a huge expense, and often, one of the biggest expenses for an organization. But having a remote workforce isn't a great way to save money if that's what you're trying to do. It's actually going to put a lot of pressure on your organization in other ways. Um, Having remote engineers and remote teams is a great way to increase your workforce and have a more diverse workforce with people from different backgrounds, from different parts of your country or the world, with different viewpoints and different ideas. That's the real power of having remote teams, letting people be where they need to be and still be able to contribute to the mission of your business. Um, so try not to think about the long term as a great way to save money. You may save a little bit of money, and that's great, but really the power of remote teams is different. So that connectedness thing, I mentioned that with a previous manager, I used to have multiple one-on-ones every week. Um, Again, they were only 10 or 15 minutes. It was a phone call. Um, talk about, as a leader, talk about what you've heard going on in the business, what you've heard, um, you know, that is worth sharing. A lot of that sort of water cooler talk, the hallway conversations that you have, that other people would probably also have and pick up on if they're in the office, are really vital to share one-on-one with remote engineers. Also share your concerns early and often. Like if you see things that aren't working well, don't let them fester or hope that they'll correct themselves. Usually they won't, because if you don't tell someone that something's broken or needs to be fixed, it's probably not going to get fixed. So find ways to share any concerns you have about the way your remote staff are working as early as you can. Have productive conversations and work together to find ways to resolve those. In person, this may end up having been, like an offhand comment in like a casual conversation, or like a very quick, like, 5-minute chat somewhere. When you're talking to remote engineers, it can be a little bit more difficult, a little bit more different, because you have to put in the energy to stop, call someone up, have that conversation. Conversation may take a little bit longer to express what you're trying to get across. When you're not face to face, the other person may isn't able to read your body language, so you have to put extra effort into making sure they understand what you're trying to say, and they appreciate whatever level of seriousness it is, whether it's just a small thing or a really big thing. um, it takes more energy and more effort. You just have to be more deliberate about it, and insist, listen to their concerns as well. If they're having difficulties with maybe getting work done, maybe communicating with other people on the team, listen to those and find ways to address them as early as you can. And individuals, you all have to insist on these conversations. If you don't, it's really easy for someone who has 35 hours of meetings a week already to skip one with you or miss one with you, and lose that sort of the consistency of having these conversations. It's really up to you to own these and drive them as much as it is for your managers or other leaders. Hiring and skills development is another important factor. We talked a little bit about hiring and onboarding. Skills development ties into this very closely. Individual contributors still need to keep learning. They still need to keep developing their skills. They still need ways to do this. If your company had an education program, a lot of sort of medium and larger size companies do, it's important to think about how can you translate that to a remote working environment. Can you move to an online format? There are lots of different things that you can do, um, but it's important to still keep thinking about how your teams can keep developing their skills. Unfortunately, we're not able to go to conferences anymore. We don't know when they'll be back. We hope soon. But sign people up for things like SRE conversations. It's a small thing, but it can be a really great and beneficial thing for people to keep staying engaged with the education part of their careers. Meeting hygiene is one of those things that a lot of people don't think about until it really needs to be thought about. These are tips I'm going to give you that really I hope a lot of people had been practicing before we all started working from home. But if they didn't, they play an even more important part in today's world. You're going to have more meetings than you used to. It's just the way it is. You have to. There's no other way to really stay connected and informed about what's happening other than setting time aside to have conversations with people. And this is part of where that feeling less productive can come in for individuals. It's now you're differently productive. And again, like if you're leading projects, there's going to be even more conversations, even more meetings. If you're having meetings over some kind of video conferencing, designate a monitor, right? Designate a moderator. Have somebody who is going to sit there and watch for people who are trying to contribute, but maybe aren't able to, dive in and say what they need to. Maybe they sit there and they raise their hands and say, I want to say something too, and they don't get the opportunity to do so. Having a designated moderator who will pause people having whatever conversation they're in and let other people interject and speak is really important. This works really well if you're in person in a meeting as well, but it's almost mandatory for meetings where everybody is remote, especially if there's more than a few people on the call. If people have poor internet connections, and it's still, there's a lot of places where this is still true. It can be true in a lot of, modern large cities as well, because we only have limited bandwidth to share, between everybody who's working from home now and is on video conferencing or is streaming, things at home. Provide a backup mechanism for people who are having a harder time participating in video conferencing meetings. Maybe provide them a back channel where they can send messages to the moderator or somebody else, and that person who maybe has a better connection is able to raise concerns or points or ask questions on behalf of other people. And this really goes a long way to, these two things really go a long way towards improving that meeting experience and just having a little bit of meeting hygiene. So teams where the majority of members are remote are often more successful than teams where only a couple of members are remote. And in fact, when I make recommendations to teams who are thinking about becoming remote teams, I say, look, don't do it unless more than 50% of the team is able to be remote. And the reason for that is actually very simple. If you don't have a large number of people, in fact, the majority of people on a team as remote, the people who are in the same location will continue to work the way that they always have. They will have hallway conversations. They will turn around and talk to each other face to face. And the people who are working remotely will be left out of a lot of the information that they need to get done, a lot of the social bonding, a lot of the communications. And at that point, they will become less effective. If you have the majority of people on your teams as remote, it's much easier for them to feel like they fit in because everyone will be treating everybody else as if they're remote. You may have 3 people in an office sitting together, maybe even at neighboring desks, and 10 people who are remote. Those 3 people will start treating each other as if they're remote as well. And this has another advantage, that those 3 people who are working together locally, maybe one of them needs to work from home 1 day a week. Maybe they need to travel somewhere. It enables everybody to get the benefits of sort of working remotely. And with that, we're going to take questions. I'm going to be in Slack, and I think we'll be on on VC. If anyone would like to join us and ask questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thanks.